Okay, hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in April, and then I'll go through some of my reading plans for May. And April has been, on the whole, a really lovely reading month. I was part of a really lovely group read. I've read plenty of poetry. And a reading event that I love has been revived as well. So it's been just a really great reading month. To start off with, I'll start off with the poetry that I read. I finished 3 books of poetry. The first and probably the most enjoyable were the collected poems of Sylvia Plath. I think as I was making my way through this in probably my last wrap up, I was talking about I suppose just how lovely it is to be going back to a poet who, at least with me and my relationship with poetry, she was one of those first poets that I connected with and I was enjoying, and she was a poet that had never been, none of her stuff had been a set text in school, and so I was sort of going off on my own and trying to find out what I liked. And so it was just good to reconnect in that way. And all the poems in here are written chronologically. And so it was interesting to see them in that context and see her sort of growing and experimenting and seeing her style sort of develop. So yeah, it was really, really good. I'll try to remember the next time I do a Poetry Thursday to do maybe a Sylvia Plath Poetry Thursday. I think she's had a couple already, but she can have some more. I don't mind. Then we've got Impromptus, the selected poems of Gottfried Benn, translated by Michael Hoffman. As a whole, this selection, it felt a little middling to me. There were some poems in here that I really enjoyed. Particularly a lot of the early poems are very visceral and immediate. That there are poems about working in a morgue, and so there's I suppose quite dark and sometimes transgressive thing going on in the poems. But it's arresting and immediate and sometimes quite humorous. But then going on towards the end, it just sometimes felt a little like the poems were dashed off, and that they weren't really being considered very seriously as they were being written. At least that's how it felt to me. So that it felt like there was very little to grapple with and engage with as I was getting further into the selection. But since there was stuff that I enjoyed in here, I don't feel too dismissive about Benn as a poet. And I'll certainly be trying, maybe after a year or two, I'll give this selection another try and see how I find it. And then the last poetry book that I finished this month was the Penguin Book of Contemporary Verse. This is a revised edition, I think from the 60s. Let's have a look. I think from about 1962. And it's predominantly British poetry. It starts off with, I think, people like W.B. Yeats and Walter de la Mare, sort of people like that, and Edward Thomas, and then it sort of just goes through up until poets writing in the early 60s. I think the last 2 poets in here are Sylvia Plath and Geoffrey Hill. And I think that the main trouble that I had with this was that I was just totally at odds with the editor. He was an incredibly snobby editor, and it feels like whenever he felt like taking a poet down a peg, he'd just do it in the introductions, and so it very much felt like his own. He's just getting stuff off his chest about these poets that really annoy him, but that I suppose they have 1 or 2 good poems that might be considered poems, not just gift card writing. So yeah, I'll include it in this in this book, and it just felt very snobby and dismissive. And he elevates some poets I think aren't really worth their salt, and then he dismisses some poets that I actually think are rather good. So we were just at total odds, I think. And sometimes there could be a poet that he really likes and I'm quite intrigued by, and he's going on in this really long introduction of, an introduction of about a page or two, say. But there's only one poem in there, and so the introduction just feels too long for what he's giving us, and he could have given us a bit more. So yeah, I didn't particularly love this anthology, and I think the editor was the reason. And who was the editor? Since it was Kenneth. Kenneth Allott was the editor. And then I'll move on to. I'm not necessarily going chronologically here, but I read the Saga of the Volsungs for Saga Long, which has been revised and revived, I should say. And I read it on my Kindle. It was announced, I think, just over a week ago as I'm filming, and I didn't really want to miss out, and I didn't want to be waiting around for, if I bought it online, I didn't want to wait around. So I just went to Project Gutenberg and I downloaded the William Morris translation. Let's have a look. It's going to be really slow now. But yeah, it was a translation of Saga of the Volsungs by William Morris, and it's got, as you can see, a very attractive cover. I really enjoyed the story. I didn't particularly love William Morris's translation, and it's got me wondering about translations of these, sort of ancient or at least quite old sagas and stories. So things like the Icelandic sagas and the early Irish sagas, the Mabinogion, the Toyn. It's got me wondering, with maybe more modern translators, are they smoothing it out, or is it that with William Morris, he seems to be trying to he's trying to find a language that's kind of like the King James Bible, but not quite, and it seems like he's making it clunky on purpose. And I think if you'd probably love reading this if you're reading it as a fan of William Morris and wanting just to read it on that basis. But as an introduction to the Saga of the Volsungs, I just felt that his translation got in the way a little bit. But it has got me wondering, is his translation closer to what it's like in Icelandic, or actually is he being somewhat artificial? So it's something I'll be thinking about, and as I read more Icelandic sagas and more translations, I'll maybe get a better idea. And then on to the book that took up most of April and most of my attention, and that was Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. And this is the Christine Donougher translation. Recently, I made a video about whittling down my library, and part of that was from noticing what I thought was book mold on here. And actually, I went kind of over the top and decided just to get rid of any books that had any traces of what I thought was book mold on it. It turns out I think most of it is really just a sort of chemical reaction in the paper itself. And so that's one good thing. But it has actually been good to I've gone through my, my those books that I was going to get rid of, and it's been a good way to work out what I wanted to keep and actually what was just sort of sitting there and would probably never be read, was kind of redundant. And so it was a good way. I did end up whittling down my library, but just not quite as significantly as I had thought at first. So thanks to everyone who let me know. I have since spilt loads of coffee on this as well, so it's not a not the most aesthetically pleasing book, but I think it'll stand up to another reading. But anyway, I was reading this with a lovely group of people, And this is just a really impressive and really satisfying novel. It definitely is one of those books that is really, really long, and you're wishing it was longer. Um, and it's essentially, I think for me, the most fascinating thing in it is, I suppose, the psychology of the characters, and just trying to think and puzzle out their motivations. So we've got Jean Valjean, who is trying to live a good life and turn his life around. We've got Marius, who holds his father in such esteem, but his maybe idea of the past and idea of his own family's history is quite blinkered. We've got even the Thenardier family, who are very they start off not that poor. They seems like most of their poverty is through the seediness and the negligence of the father of the family. But they do end up in ruin and in misery. But unfortunately, at least for the father and the mother, you don't really have that much sympathy for them. But even with them, trying to work out their motivations and trying to work out what they're going to do next is really fascinating. And so a lot of that was what was keeping me interested in the book. The writing, it just feels like a hot knife going through butter. It's not intimidating at all as you're reading it. A lot of people talk about the digressions in Hugo, and about how it kind of takes you out of the story. And at least for me, and at least for a few of the other people in the group that I was reading this with, essentially, once you get through them, and once you get sort of to the end of the book, you can see these digressions on the Battle of Waterloo, on the history of this convent in the middle of Paris, about the usages of slang on the streets of Paris, and on the Paris sewer system. All of these, once you sort of get through them, just paint such a much more vivid picture of the world of this novel. And so you sort of get through, and you feel like you've been living in this world. So it's really quite remarkable. And I think that the message of the book is, for reform and improved social conditions, and I suppose just bringing the real plight of people living in rather destitute conditions to the fore. That seemed like something very close to Hugo's heart. So all in all, just a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm kind of obviously inclined to compare this to War and Peace. I think they've both got something similar going on. That they're both kind of trying to explain the almost like the soul of a nation through these characters, and through these events, these sort of large scale historical events. And so for Tolstoy, it is the Russian invasion the French invasion of Russia. And for Tolstoy, it is not for Hugo. It's the firstly the after effects of the French losing the Battle of Waterloo, and then this sort of tug of war between revolutionary and reactionary powers and monarchist powers, and the eventual sort of bubbling up towards yet another revolution. So yeah, it's just really sort of fascinating stuff, and yet doing this with some really quite fascinating characters. And you become quite attached to these characters, but there's a much bigger story going on at the same time. And then the other book that I finished this month was, I just wanted to pick up something a bit shorter and possibly gentler after finishing Les Miserables. So I picked up The Exiles Return by Elisabeth Duval, one I've been meaning to get to for quite some time. It was written in the 50s, and it wasn't published until about 2012. And essentially the story of a small cast of characters who, for various reasons, have found themselves coming back to Vienna, or some of them coming to Vienna for the first time in the early 1950s, sort of just before um, the occupation of Vienna is about to end. So just after the Second World War, the US, the UK, France, and Russia essentially decided that um, um, Austria should become a sort of neutral state on the Swiss model. And so they occupied it. They all had their zones across the country, and they all had their zones in Vienna. And so these four nations were sort of keeping things going, and sort of, I suppose, maybe monitoring things in the aftermath of the Second World War. And then I think in 1955, something like that, they then withdrew, and Austria got its independence again. And so that's the sort of historical backdrop. And the book really starts with a middle-aged professor called Kuno Adler. And he, I think just before the Anschluss, when the Nazis invaded Austria, he sort of could see where things were going. And so he and his family they went over to America. He didn't particularly like it there. His wife and his kids sort of immediately settle and become acclimatized and sort of make a life for themselves. And then after the war, by the early to mid 50s, suddenly he's heard that there are I can't remember quite the name of it. Essentially like reinstation laws, but that's not quite the name for it. But anyway, he can go back and he can get his old job back, essentially, as long as it's sort of financially possible for the institute that he worked for. And so essentially, he says to his family that he's going back because it's home for him. His family feel like they've made a life for themselves in America, and so they decide to stay behind. So he's essentially sort of split up from his family. And I suppose even though people around him might think that maybe once he's more settled, his family will follow, really he's probably never going to see them again. But for him, it's just that much more important to get back to home and rebuild his roots. And for me, what I really loved about this book and what I found the most compelling was this feeling of wanting to go back and things be the same, and then for the first part, realizing that things just can't be the same. They're not the same. This city's been bombed. Loads of buildings are just rubble now. There are avenues where all the trees have been pulled out, and things like that. So it's going to be a very different city to the city he remembers. But also then when he's going to get his job back, realizing, okay, I've been told I actually will be getting my old job back, but it's been 15 years. I'm now, he's now like in his late 40s, he's nearly 50 years old. And so to be going back to his old job um, isn't necessarily a good thing. Like, really, he'd be expecting, eventually some kind of promotion and to be going up in the world, but he's going back to exactly where he was 15 years ago. And so it's, just seeing how terrible it is that things aren't the same, but also seeing how terrible it is for things to be just as they were, as if the last 15 years had never happened. So yeah, I found that really, really compelling. There's a whole other cast of characters. A lot of the book is concerned with a young girl. I want to see if it mentions her in here at all. I'm trying to see if I can remember her name. They call her Resi, which is short for Mary Therese. and she's from an old aristocratic Austrian family. Her mother married a, a scientist from Denmark who wasn't aristocratic, and then they moved to America, and so the family have kind of shunned them a little bit, even though relations have sort of got a little warmer, I suppose, as years have gone on. Yeah, so she's heard this young girl Resi has heard about Austria and Vienna, but it's very foreign to her, even if it is where her family is from. And so a big part of the story is her going over there because her family think she's been finding things difficult at home, and so maybe she needs a breath of fresh air. So she goes over to meet her relations in Austria, and then there's the people she meets, and it's just it's a very slow, at least initially, a very slow and gentle and sort of quietly profound book. And then as it goes on, it's kind of like a Dickens novel where you're seeing that um, like each of these characters is connected to at least two of the other characters, and this sort of spider's web starts growing as you get deeper into the book. Um, the main sort of criticisms I have, because I did really love it, but the main criticisms I think I have are whenever the action is building and something dramatic is going to happen, it always feels a little more melodramatic, and it doesn't feel like the author is in complete control at that point. And then I suppose the other thing is with that spider web, the more it goes on, the more artificial it feels as well. And so by the end, you're not quite believing that all these connections are possible, that they could be possible, but just the way it's delivered as it goes on feels a little rushed and feels a little artificial. But on the whole, I really enjoyed this. It sort of reminds me of Daphne du Maurier a little bit, not quite as gloomy and ominous, but that's sort of the closest author I could sort of pinpoint this to. So yeah, it's still recommend it, but just keep your eye out for a little bit of melodrama here and there. And then three books that are still ongoing. We've got The Night is Darkening Round Me, so some poems by Emily Bronte. And this was inspired by reading Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt. I am, I don't know, about 800, just short of 800 pages into this. And whenever I get to a chapter about, I don't know, there's just chapters about certain poets where I suddenly get really excited. And there's a chapter about Emily Bronte and Emily Dickinson and Christina Rossetti, and particularly those three. They very much feel like my kind of bread and butter poets, going back to Sylvia Plath, some of those early poets that got me excited about poetry. And so after reading that chapter, I just felt really excited, and I felt like I needed to get straight back to their poems. And so I picked this straight up as soon as I'd finished, I think, the Penguin Book of Modern Verse, which was what I was reading at the time. And so I sort of, once I realised I wasn't enjoying it, sort of just got through it as quickly as I could, was kind of hate reading it, so I could get to Emily Bronte. With Lives of the Poets now, it's got me really intrigued because essentially once it gets to poets like T.S. Eliot and H.D. and Ezra Pound, once it gets to that point, he takes a pause for breath, and he sort of realizes, because this is written in the 1990s, and he sort of realizes he's getting towards territory that's a little more close to home. He's going to be getting to poets that maybe still be alive and still be writing, and so he just wants to sort of pause because it's harder to categorize poets into movements when you're so close to them. It's kind of something that happens, sort of after the fact. And so essentially what he's doing is he's looking at, sort of poets as far back as like William Carlos Williams, but then sort of moving forward, some poets that may be a little more recent, but sort of putting them together into sort of little groupings and sort of seeing how either by sort of style or by their preoccupations there might be something, um, so some kind of similarity between them, and some kind of sort of antecedents going on there. And it's been really interesting, really fascinating, and it's getting me thinking about poets that I want to reconsider, I want to try again, poets I hadn't heard of, and it's just been great. Particularly at the moment, I'm thinking about reconsidering Elisabeth Bishop, who I've never really disliked. I just haven't had that sort of connection to her yet, and so I quite like to reconsider her, and John Ashbery as well. Um, I haven't really sunk my teeth into him yet, and so I'd like to give him more of a try. And it's been getting me thinking that I think once I've finished the Emily Bronte, instead of picking up a poetry collection, essentially something I've been doing is in the Norton Anthology of Poetry, I've been um, I've been starring certain poets that I'd like to get to on the contents page, and so what I might do is go through some of those starred poets, and then just kind of see what I think of them and read more if I need to. Next up, the only other thing that's still ongoing, the Diaries of Franz Kafka, and I'm still sort of dipping in. I'm coming up to about the halfway point, and it might end up being a year-long project. And then for next month, I've just got 4 books that I'd like to read. First up, we've got The Stronghold by Dino Buzzati, about a stronghold with sort of mountains in a desert nearby. It's very remote, and they're sort of waiting for this imminent enemy to arrive, but they've been waiting for ages. And then we've got Inventing the Enemy by Umberto Eco, and it very much feels like some of the things he's talking about in here sort of might be mirrored in um, the Stronghold, and so I'm going to try and read them at around the same time and see how that goes. Then we've got the Fall of Constantinople by Stephen Runciman, and I'll be reading this for Historathon, and it'll fall into the current sort of time period that they're looking at. So this is about the Ottomans taking Constantinople in 1453. And then finally, we've got The Pillow Book by Say Shonagon, and this looks to be, it's written by a court gentlewoman, and apparently it's one of the greatest works of Japanese literature, and it's a fascinating exploration of life amongst the nobility at the height of the idyllic Heian period, and it describes the exquisite pleasures of a confined world in which poetry, love, fashion, and whim dominated, and harsh reality was kept firmly at a distance. And this is something that Classics and Company, so this is a kind of ongoing reading event that Anne Novella and Micah Cummins have started. And every 6 weeks they read another classic of world literature. And this is what they're reading from mid-May through to the end of June. So I won't be getting to this until the end of May, but then I'll be reading it along with them, and they asked me to be a co-host for one of the books, and then this is the one that I will be co-hosting, and so I'm looking forward to reading this, and I'll probably be doing some sort of research around the sides to see what I can find out about it. But that is it. So that's everything that I read in April, and some of my ongoing things, and then some of my plans for May. But yeah, I will leave it there. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a really, really lovely May. Take care. Bye bye.